Joining me today for a conversation about leadership is Christopher Elliott. He had a distinguished career in the military, in the British Army, having commanded an armoured brigade on the British Army of the Rhine. He was Director of Military Operations in the Ministry of Defence and also Director of Studies at the Camberley Staff College. Following his service in the military, Christopher went on to be a research fellow at Oxford for a while. He is also was a visiting professor at Cranfield University and found time to write a book called High Command. And on top of that, he also sails and paraglides. So how he manages to fit all of that into a busy life, we'll find out in a moment. But Christopher's joining us today, ready to share his experience of leadership, both in the military and also later in industry. Christopher, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us. So let's start with your experience in your military career. You know, leadership is a big topic. It's a big subject. But what are some of the things that you learnt while in the military that helped you lead people, you know, whether it be in the British Army of the Rhine or maybe working in the Ministry of Defence and all the other roles that you had? Tell us a little bit about some of the things that you've learned through your military career.
Well, Matthew, can I start by saying it's very generous of you to invite me in my twilight years to come and talk about something that is, of course, very interesting to anybody who's been in such a role.
Yeah.
I start off by saying that some people are so charismatic in their nature that other people will simply follow them in a trance, perhaps the end of the earth. But that's a very rare quality, and it's not always benign. Think of Adolf Hitler. But almost everybody else has it in them to lead if they apply themselves.
Right, yeah.
And leadership is an exciting and immensely fulfilling task, and it's worth all the tears and setbacks that occur to leaders on the route. So I commend to you, seek it out. I shall frame my answer about military leadership in the way that the military is itself taught in three parts: the task, the team, and the individual. Starting with the task, well, above all else, you have to deliver success, because a glorious failure, or a second best, is a failure of leadership. To do that, you have to understand the task that you're being asked to do. If some parts are beyond your own knowledge and experience, you have to find a suitable expert to help you. But never fudge, never fly blind. You must also know what's going on within the task and surrounding the task. For that, you need a good intelligence system. The more subtle, the better. You must also exercise leadership upwards, as I would say, to keep your sponsors engaged. So if the going gets difficult, they will help you through it. And a good rule about leadership upwards is that there should be no surprises to your masters.
And was there a situation, or was it a situation that you found yourself in where any one of those three things you've mentioned, the task and the sort of leadership aspects of it, you thought, looking back on it, yes, actually, I should have done more of that, or I should have done more of this, or maybe my intelligence, the links I had needed to be developed further?
Well, I'd be here all day if I gave all the points where I'd failed. But when you were saying that, one point did arise which strung a bell. I was responsible for training and recruiting the army in a very large organization, whose lifeblood was the money coming into it. And therefore, leadership upwards to my sponsors in the Ministry of Defence was hugely, hugely important if they were going to continue to provide the extra cash that we thought was necessary to keep the flow of recruits and train people into the army. And so I did spend quite a lot of time telling my masters what we were doing and explaining what we were doing, so that they could never say they didn't understand what was happening.
Right, yeah.
The second part of leadership in the military is the team. And you have to build a team to match the task. And to do that, you want to try and bring in a constellation of different talents. Having got that, you have to build those individuals into a cohesive team. Maybe use a social event, maybe to get them to explain their skills, and get them to get their past achievements off their chest, which everybody wants to do. Maybe it's the moment when those that don't know anything should be able to confess it, so they can just show that they're eager to help. More importantly than anything else, everybody must buy in that team to what you're going to do. This was also begin the process of getting rid of what I would describe as the bad hats. Some people cannot ever be appealed to, whatever you do, and they must be got rid of before they threaten the whole task. You must clearly explain what the task is, and then genuinely ask for any better ideas. Where possible, you should share the team's travails, like late nights, weekend work, being outside in the rain if they have to, not in your office. Not all the time, but enough, because you have an office to do work in.
And I mean, this sounds full of really useful practical hints and tips. There must have been some really interesting teams that you worked with, or maybe situations where you did find yourself out in the rain or in the mud or whatever, having to explain a task to a team or find out how they were feeling and what ideas they've got.
As a major, I took my squadron to the Falkland Isles just after the war had finished.
Yeah.
And it was pretty chaotic there. And we lived in dreadful conditions, and everybody worked 12 hours a day. One of the tasks as a combat engineer I had was to run a quarry. And the quarry was the lifeblood of the whole of the engineering rebuilding of Port Stanley.
Yeah.
And so I had a 24-hour system going there. And it was only after about the 5th month that I realized that I had concentrated on seeing what was going on, excuse me, during the day, and being with the 300 soldiers who were working during there. But I had not visited the night shift on the quarry sufficiently. I'd been up there once every 3 weeks or in the middle of the night, because it was a real burden for me to get up after a long day myself. But anyway, I discovered one night when I was up there that they had an effigy of the mascot of the squadron, which was a beaver, because the squadron had built the Rideau Canal in Canada many years previously. And they got this beaver, which they'd made, and they put a noose around it, and they stuck a shovel through it. And I suddenly realized that I'd got a clan out there who were not buying in to the complete bond of friendship between people that I had expected. And so I visited them a lot more.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I remember years ago doing some change work up in Wolverhampton with Lucas Aerospace. And there was a night shift there when I first started, and I'd never been on the night shift. The same thing, in fact, happened at Rolls-Royce at Derby. And it was really quite an eye-opener to spend some time with the night shift team, who invariably had didn't have the same experience as their colleagues would have on the day shift, when lots and lots of people were in and the managers were all in and things were going on. And I found that, for me, a real learning experience, that how easy it is sometimes that you sort of assume that things are happening or going on, but unless you actually visit a place and be with people and talk to them, sometimes you can get quite a different picture to the reality of the situation. So these guys were on the night shift in the quarry. You visited them and talked to them, and how did that then influence the way that you felt about the sort of leading them and getting the job done, getting the task done?
Well, contact with them was sufficient.
Yeah. And
I said, what's that thing doing up there? There was a lot of giggling, and the moment passed. Yeah. That brings me, I think, on to the third leg of the team, the task, and the individual. The individual, you must know your team that you've got, so that they individually feel valued. And so you discover the levers that will make them individually perform. And the most important thing there is that each of them has a name, which you must know. Not difficult if you've got a small team, but quite a challenge if you've got a big team. Talk to each person directly, one-to-one, every day, if at all possible, if only for a minute. Yeah. It gives them the opportunity for them to unburden themselves about something that is worrying them if they need to. But also, they may have a good idea to offer, which they've been too shy to put forward.
And did you find when you did that sometimes there were some ideas or some comments they made that really helped you in leading them as a group of people?
Well, of course.
Yeah.
I think the next point is that you should never make fun or belittle a subordinate in front of others. So be very, very careful when you're giving a rocket. Sometimes it's necessary, and you must have the moral courage to do that.
Yeah.
But words once said can never be undone. I think the golden rule here is praise 5 times and criticize once.
Right. Yeah.
You must reward achievement, but you must be very careful of not rewarding the same person every time, even though he's the best, because you must not have favorites.
Yeah.
I think also linked to that telling people how they're getting on honestly is always a challenge for a leader. And a great scheme that I adopted far too late in life is an American idea, and it's structuring your feedback in 3 areas. First, you say to them, you've performed to expectations here.
Yeah.
You then say, in this area, you've exceeded expectations. And then in the 3rd area, this needs improvement. So, perform to expectations, we're doing okay. Exceeding expectations, you've surprised us and you're doing really well. Yeah. Needs improvement, you've got to buck up there.
And how did that, when you used that, what are the sort of things you noticed? Were people accepting of it, or was it sometimes difficult for them to understand that actually what you were saying was really quite important and that they needed to listen to it?
Well, they found it much more easy to understand that than the 15-page appraisal that was common in industry.
Right.
And when we started a startup, we adopted this scheme in our human relations with each of the employees. And every 6 months, the managing director would take that scheme and talk through with the individuals on a single sheet of paper in those 3 categories. And it worked very, very well indeed.
Great, yeah. So moving from the military into your sort of career in industry and also your work at Cranfield, were there lots of differences, or were there sort of similar things that you were having to deal with in terms of leadership, and that some of what or a lot of what you'd learnt in the army played out for you in your time in industry?
Well, I just finish off with one thing to do with the individual, which is about losing your temper. Because it is just allowable as a theatrical device if you need to blow your top. But if you actually lose your temper, you risk losing control. And I think that in the military is just as important as in the civilian side. And I found that in my time in civilian life, people lost their tempers much more than they did in the military. But the downside was common in both. But to answer your question, it's surprisingly similar, military and civilian leadership, and the same rules will apply. But there are 2 things in the services that you can assume are going to happen, and they're 2 important things. First, that service people will generally do as they're told, because it's a clear hierarchy of command, and they've been given an order, and they will be generally carried out. Second, and this is to do with the ethos of training and the way they've been brought up, and is very important, almost without exception, they will go a long way not to let you down.
Yeah.
Now, those 2 things don't naturally occur in civilian life because people go there to earn their pay. So you have to try and replicate it. And I think the first thing is to try and instill a sense of discipline and trust. I always found it extremely frustrating to turn up to a meeting when my first civilian job, find out that nobody else was there. So you have to make sure that everybody's on time, start meetings on time, and even though this sounds quite quaint today, you should dress considerately to other people. Coming in a t-shirt might be fashionable, but it may not be what the older members of the team are really going to appreciate.
Yeah.
I knew one chap who started a plumbing company from nothing, and he always insisted that his plumbers changed into indoor shoes, which were clean, on entering a client's house.
Yeah.
And always at the end, before putting on their outdoor shoes, got a hoover and a brush out to sweep up. And of course, that guy had more work to do than he knew how to cope with.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think also you should always reply to emails. And if you're going to say you're going to do something, make sure you actually do it. Because otherwise people will say, oh, he's only saying that, and the moment will pass. But conversely, if your subordinates tell you they're going to do something, they must know that you've written it down, you will remember, and you would expect an answer.
Yeah.
I think very importantly when trying to lead in civilian life is you've got to bind your top team to you, because they're the people who will deliver for you. It's that team that if it's not a coherent team with all of them getting on reasonably well together, then it's not going to happen underneath it.
So what sort of things did you do to sort of bind the team together? What did you find helpful if you were trying to get your colleagues to work with you or you with them?
Well, I go back to all the things I said before, but you have to tell them what's going on. You have to approach them individually. Do you understand what you're doing? Have you got a better idea? It's very useful to have some sort of collegiate off-site day doing something together. I do remember there that you have to be quite careful what you do, because my daughter worked for a think tank in London,
yeah.
And she told me that she was going off to Wales for a get-together weekend. Late on Friday evening, the car arrived back at house, and my daughter got out, and I said, "You're back early?" And she said, "Yes, I don't do tree hugging." And so there is an artificiality, which I have experienced in industry, about people being forced to do things which are clearly false and not natural. It's usually around a debate, and a meal together at some stage is a great leveler.
Yeah, yeah.
I think another point, which is not done enough in civilian life, but which is a feature of the military, is you should show great consideration to the worker bees, so that they will go an extra mile for you. And what you do there is you begin to form a herd from the bottom upwards that is rooting for you.
Yeah.
And it's the foundation of a winning team. The top smart people at the top, if they see that all the secretaries and everybody else say, "Oh, it's really great being here," and that sort of thing, it's contagious.
Yeah.
And so spending time with the people on the shop floor is also very important.
Yeah.
I remember a story of a friend of mine who took over a French armaments company. He was British, going into a French company. And he, to his astonishment, found out that on arrival as le directeur, his obligation was to go around all of the workforce, and it took him 45 minutes every morning, and shake them by hand. "Bonjour, monsieur so-and-so. Bonjour, monsieur so-and-so."
Wow.
And then walk on, and, "Comment allez-vous?" And he thought this was a huge burden. But he realized that it gave him the opportunity to link in with every single member of the workforce.
Yeah.
And it's something that other people could replicate. I think you also have to be open about your hopes and fears and challenges, because you're then binding in your team to what you're trying to achieve. If they think that you're fudging it or flying blind or haven't noticed something's going wrong, their confidence in you will be very low.
So how do you get that balance then between, being realistic, sort of explaining things as they are, and also sort of matching that with that sort of, I won't say over optimism, but that, we can do this, we can get on with it, we're going to make this happen. In your experience, what's the sort of skill at balancing those two elements, if you like, of a situation?
Well, don't pretend it's going to go well if it isn't going well. I mean, you have to be open and honest with people. And I remember the company that I joined on leaving the army was led by the best leader that I've ever met, military or civilian.
Right.
And the company had committed itself to a sum of £2 billion to build a new communications infrastructure system.
Yeah.
And as is typical of communications, it was all algorithms, it was equations, and you couldn't see it. And so it's extremely difficult to know how the different parts were actually traveling. It was a scheme that was being built by companies from all around the world, which we were the systems integrator. And every month, everybody would meet around a very big table, or representatives of each of the companies. And Larry, the managing director, would go around them and he'd say quietly, well, James, tell me how it's going with you.
Yeah.
And he'd say, so-and-so, so-and-so. And then, Fred, how is the system going? He'd go around everybody, and everybody would have a chance to say their piece. They had confidence that they were given the chance to say their piece without being interrogated, which was something that was very important. But at the end, having listened to all of this, everybody around the table had the clear impression they were staring at a £2 billion failure, because it couldn't possibly succeed.
Yes.
And Larry, of course, said, well, times are tough and we're doing this and that's not going right. But I think that I've got confidence in Fred over there, and he's going in the right direction. And James has got that bit, and we've got some good news over there. And I'm absolutely confident that we're going to be able to do this for the following reasons. And if necessary, I have a little bit of extra money up my sleeve, which we can spend on that. But this is going to work. And it did.
Yeah.
It was an astounding piece of leadership. And you carried that load for 2 years or more. I think it goes back to this thing of exploring ideas and discussing problems openly in free-for-all groups, not just issuing edicts from on high, and giving every team member a sense of ownership of what they're doing. As a commanding officer, one of the burdens you carry is that the people just below you, 800 soldiers in a regiment, in 4 different squadrons, the squadron commanders all know that they could do your job better than you're doing it. Yes. And they're eager to transit into your job at the first opportunity. And so actually keeping that group together and not allowing them to run over you is quite difficult. And I developed a scheme which served me extremely well. I mean, one of the blokes was far more intelligent than me, and he could instantly manipulate the facts given the chance. But anyway, I decided when I had a big problem that I would decide what I was going to do. I would then have all of the 4 squadron commanders into my office, relaxed meeting, go on for at least 2 hours, sit them down with coffee, have a whiteboard and say, well, look, what we're going to challenge with is this, this, and this. And we can do it several bits and ways. But what are your own ideas without clearing mine? I go around the audience. Yeah. And I would never say to them, that's a brilliant idea. I said, that's got some worth in it. Now, Charles, what do you think? And he then say what he was doing. And I then say to the others, well, has anybody got any idea about it? And they would then discuss their own bits and pieces. And then I'd come up at the end, which I think to me was the key issue. I'd say, well, look, we all know in a regiment, we can only have one plan. Yeah. There are 300 good ideas there. And sadly, it's my responsibility, not yours, to decide what the plan's going to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all those ideas and my own ideas, and I'm going to think about them overnight. And tomorrow morning, you'll get the orders which say what we're going to do. And I know that you will support it. And what I did next morning was write out or issue the orders that I'd already written the day before. But everybody was completely bought into it. Most importantly, that discussion had given me the chance to see where the pinch points were in other people's things, because they would bring up saying, well, we haven't done so-and-so, so-and-so, and I'm not sure about so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. So getting them to sort of externalize those things was extremely important. And I would modify my plans as a result of that, without doubt.
Yeah. So that to me sounds like a really, really wise piece of advice. So if, sitting next to you now, there were 2 or 3 younger people just sort of starting off their career, whether it's military or in industry or in local government, health service or whatever, what might be a couple of things that, with all the experience you've got, what might be a couple of things that you'd suggest that they need to pay attention to? It's just starting off. What are some of the fundamentals that you might say? Well, if you've got, you're going to make mistakes, but if you focus on these 2 points, it'll give you a good foundation.
Well, I'm going to sound like a crack record. You've got to be yourself.
Yeah.
Perhaps if you're nervous, don't show it and try and conceal your inner doubts, because your subordinates are watching you and the power of example is enormous. It reminds me of a friend who had a notice above his chair in his office. He was managing director of a company he'd started. And the notice simply said, "We don't do blame,"
Right.
which is an extremely powerful message. Not dwelling on the mistake that's been made, getting on with it. And I used to say to my own subalterns, look, when I first had them in for a tortured hour when they probably didn't remember anything, but I'd say, look, what we do is a dangerous thing, and you're bound to make mistakes. You may even kill somebody. But I won't be interested in the mistake you've made. I'm simply interested in what you're doing about it to dig yourself out of it. Yeah. And I think that's a very important attitude to have, not to criticize or dwell on the mistake that's been made, but get on with it. Yeah. This chap, my friend John, also always traveled economy class, even though the rules of his company, and people did travel first class. And on one occasion, he went to India with a sales chap from some distance down the company, and he split his allowed first class into 2 premium economies, so this chap could go with him in a class he wouldn't have had. And I think that sort of might be theatrical, but it has an enormous effect on people beneath you, because it's saying a sort of sacrifice for them.
Yeah.
I think that a second side to it is, and I mentioned this to begin with, you have to train yourself to be calm and focused under pressure. Pressure's going to come, but don't spin off the plate as it arrives. Try and be cheerful and optimistic. Remember what I said about Larry, who took the whole burden of everybody's anxieties on his shoulders. So people left that meeting thinking it could succeed. And anyway, it wasn't their problem to worry about the company. He was worrying about it.
Yeah.
I think also you should show a bit of passion that we want to do this. We want it to succeed. And passion is quite different from derangement, where you're simply saying, get going. Another thing which is very important, which is, I think, not practiced enough in civilian life, is that you mustn't be disloyal to your superiors. Yeah. Because you can hardly expect loyalty to you if you're showing disloyalty upwards. And often it will be deserved because they cocked it up. So avoid the whinge sessions around the water cooler, which happen in every company. Just make it clear that you're not going to tolerate that.
Yeah.
I went back to Sandhurst, having trained a young cadet in my own platoon when I was sort of 30 years previously, when I was an instructor at Sandhurst. And this chap had become the commandant as a major general. And he was taking the final parade, and he went out and spoke to them all before the Queen's representative came down for the Sovereign's parade. And he said, "I've only one thing to say to you." And I was waiting that something I'd said to him 30 years, a pearl of wisdom, would come out. And I was mortified that he said something better than I'd ever taught him. He said, "Look, when you come up to a problem, don't do what you immediately want to do. Consider for a moment what you ought to do." And I think that is a very good lesson in leadership and in life.
Yeah. Christopher, I think actually that's rather a nice spot to leave our conversation for the moment, because it's very powerful. And certainly I know in the work I do, lots of leaders do fall into that trap of feeling they must do something immediately, they must respond, they must react. And just taking some time to step back and think about it, and think about what you ought to do rather than what you might immediately want to do, I think is a really good learning. Just to
Matthew, can I steal just another 30 seconds?
Please do.
Well, there's a very important thing that if I was short of time, I would have put right at the beginning, because it's something that I think troubles people.
Yeah.
I just like to encourage people that ambition is legitimate.
Yeah.
It's the motor that has taken humankind forward. I mean, look at Elon Musk.
Yeah.
He might have a very strange social life, but he's produced Tesla cars. He's got the first chap in the Dragon, people in the space shuttle to get to the things. It's an astonishing achievement, and that man had ambition.
Yeah.
However, just be careful of what you do to achieve your ambitions. People that work with you are not a ladder for you to get up to get there.
Yeah.
Secondly, be kind to yourself. Not everything is going to go right. In fact, it certainly will not go right. But don't beat yourself up about it. Reflect, learn, correct what you made a mistake, apologize where necessary, and then move on.
Wise words. And are you still paragliding?
No. The Commander-in-Chief made me sell it 4 years ago.
Oh, dear. Christopher, it's been great talking to you, and thank you for sharing your ideas. And it would be lovely to come back and continue the conversation if you're up for it at some point in the near future.
Matthew, thank you for asking me.
Pleasure. It's been absolutely super. Thank you so much.